This is Chuck Johnson. I'm the plant pathologist here at the Southern Piedmont Center near Blackstone, Virginia. And I'm sure we'd all prefer to be outside today and doing this field day differently. But I hope that what I've got prepared for you today will be interesting and helpful and useful to you. Despite the COVID-19 epidemic, our Southern Piedmont staff have really been dedicated in trying to conduct as normal a field research season as possible, while at the same time following all the COVID-19 safety guidelines. And due to their dedication, we have 8 tobacco field experiments currently ongoing at the Southern Piedmont Center. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be having that research conducted, and we certainly wouldn't be doing this field day. Most of these trials investigate how to better manage tobacco blackshank, which I think we probably all know is one of our most important tobacco diseases in Virginia. And we're conducting blackshank fungicide trials for both flue-cured and Connecticut tobacco. We're also conducting studies evaluating blackshank resistance in both dark tobacco and flue-cured tobacco. And most of the entries or the treatments in our blackshank resistance trial here on the station this year is focused on providing data to the regional flue-cured tobacco variety evaluation program on potential new tobacco entries in the regional farm test and the regional small plot test, which are 2 different phases of that new variety evaluation program. So blackshank, has been an issue in Virginia since I think it was in the 1920s when it first. No, well, it was a long time ago. And but over the last month or so, it's really started showing up, and I've been asking questions why. So I've got some thoughts about that question, why is it showing up now, that I would like to share with you now, and as we talk about blackshank. One of the things we need to remember is that blackshank is caused by a fungus-like organism called Phytophthora nicotiana that actually lives in the soil in tobacco fields. It doesn't infect any other plants with a few exceptions other than tobacco, but it can last a long time in our soils and create a problem. And this particular organism makes swimming spores that can move through the water film within soil to find susceptible plant parts, which would be the roots and stems. So anything that increases the soil water in a field is going to help that organism move around and find roots and stems to infect. It's going to tend to make diseases worse. Another thing that I think when we think about how we grow tobacco, how it grows in Virginia, is when roots are produced, because certainly roots are one of the primary targets for this pathogen. And so we know that within the next few days after transplanting, those plants start to produce roots from the stems, particularly that are in the soil and in the furrow. And we know that after we throw all that soil up against the row at lay-by, that's another big flush of tobacco root production. And the third period of time in the crop phenology that I think is important for blackshank is that when we top, that actually stimulates root production, especially root tips. So after transplanting, but especially at lay-by when the plants are bigger and there's more roots, and after topping when the root systems are even bigger but get even bigger than that, those are key opportunity times for that blackshank pathogen to find and infect tobacco. We also know that there's a relationship between weather and blackshank incidence. And we know that we tend to see more diseases in growing seasons where the weather alternates between being very wet and going to hot and dry, and very wet and hot and dry. And the reason for that is I was trying to explained before, is that wet weather helps the black shank pathogen spread. It helps those swimming spores move through the soil. And it also, when we have thunderstorms and in fields like in Virginia with rolling countryside, and you have washing soil, it goes down the row middles and comes up against the plants. When that soil washes, if it has that black shank pathogen in it, it spreads that disease very quickly and efficiently. And many of us have seen that in the past. That's not a pretty sight. But we know that, but you know what we look at and what we care about is above the ground. The black shank interaction between the pathogen and the plant is actually below the ground, right at the surface of the soil. But what we care about is the above ground parts of the plant, especially the leaves. And tobacco is a tough plant, and it can live and survive through a lot of bad conditions. But under hot, dry weather and the root system has been compromised, or the stem has been compromised, then that's when we start to see leaves yellowing and wilting and the margins burning and the plant's dying because the top of the plant can't get what it needs from the ground. And the amount of time that it takes a plant to react to all these conditions, is a while. So, my personal opinion is it's at least a few days, but more likely it's at least a week and even longer. So, is that related to the fact that we tend to see black shank showing up a week or two after lay-by, or once we get close to topping time and we've got those big root systems in the ground, then we top them and they get even bigger? Maybe so. Another important thing to remember is that although we have much, much, much better resistant cultivars for black shank and flue-cured tobacco than we had in the past, even during my career lifetime, none of these cultivars are immune. That's to say that if those plants stay in the ground long enough, under a variety of conditions, sooner or later, some of the plants in any of these cultivars are probably going to get black shank. So we shouldn't necessarily be surprised if we get the most resistant variety that's available and we put it in a hot black shank condition. If we are unlucky in terms of weather conditions or we have other things going on, we will see some black shank in those varieties. And that may be some of what goes on every year, and certainly this year included. But if you think that our flue-cured varieties aren't as good as some people say, or as I say, look at the background on this slide. This is a Connecticut tobacco black shank fungicide test that we did this year. And we did it because we have some friends and colleagues in other states who don't have some of the black shank fungicide products that we have in Virginia. So I was hoping that we could do a trial that would help them, help those friends and colleagues. And we have a little Connecticut tobacco in Virginia. We hope that might be an alternative for some folks here. So we certainly wanted to know whether or not the practices that we use of flue-cured tobacco in Virginia would work for Connecticut as well. And so we planted Connecticut in this field, and we used some fairly standard treatments. So that top row here is OGRG, stands for Arondis Gold, Ridamil Gold. We put that out in the transplant water on everything but our untreated control. We then came back at the first cultivation and put down either Ridamil Gold, that's the RG, or P stands for Presidio. And then at the last cultivation, we put down either Presidio, Ridamil Gold, and in this case, we put down Arondis, a mixture of Arondis and Ridamil Gold as well. But the short story from all this is that none of it really worked. We lost every single plant in this experiment well before topping time. You can see that even the dead plants aren't barely knee high. So nothing really worked. And the reason is not because these fungicides are bad. It's because we've grown tobacco for black shank research in this field since 1974. And under the conditions of 2020 and type of tobacco had absolutely no resistance to blackshank, nothing could work. So this was an unfortunate result, but I hope it helps us learn some things. So I mentioned we were looking at blackshank resistance in flue-cured tobacco, and the regional variety evaluation program for flue-cured tobacco has two phases. One is called the regional small plot test. That's the first and original year of testing, and then there's a regional farm test. The varieties or entries that pass, they have to be evaluated and actually be voted on and passed to get to the regional farm test. And the regional farm test is the last phase, and the entries that are in the RFT have to be approved in order for seed companies to sell them to growers. So the focus of the variety program is really on what the tobacco companies want, but disease resistance has always been a big part of that evaluation as well. So you can see here some of the entries from the 2020 regional farm test, and you can see this RFT3. The name of that entry is actually RJREX602, and you can see we've got a number of these entries, and then I mixed in released varieties that hopefully you're familiar with, and those are in green, like NC95, and that's a very highly resistant flue-cured variety. NC1229 is probably the most resistant variety, we think, of anything we've ever had. NC196, which is very popular now, it has a moderate level of resistance. K326, we consider a susceptible variety now, but I remember when it was first released, people said it had low resistance to blackshank. And then PVH 2275 is what I use as a susceptible standard or control. PVH 2275 is a released variety, and it was one of the first that had resistance to the different types of root knot nematodes that we deal with now, but it's even more susceptible to blackshank than K326. And you can see that early on everything stood up pretty well, but once we got to the end of July and into August, we started to see some differences. Now this tobacco is around post-topping stage now, so we've got another 6 weeks or so to collect data, and so some of these varieties that look like they're doing pretty well now may not look so good here in a little bit. But as of now, we see a lot. It seems to me we have a lot of evidence of some potential new varieties come along with very good resistance to blackshank. Here's just it's a long list of entries, and you can see here there's a number of these entries that are holding up pretty well. You can see that even K326 has still got a 90% stand as of last week, and whereas the 2275 there's a quarter of it gone, and probably more even gone today. Now, the regional small plot test is, I mentioned, that's the first phase, and again you can see here that we've got the released varieties mixed in here with them, and we see some pretty good resistance in those varieties as well. Another factor that I think plays into when we see blackshank showing up and why it tends to show up late is that while we have 3 very good blackshank fungicides now, Arondis, Presidio, and Ridamil, none of these materials last forever, as is true for, I think, every single crop protection agent or pesticide that's ever been developed, ever will be developed. They start degrading or decaying or going away almost as soon as they leave the applicator, the spray tip or whatever. And they don't go away on a straight line. They go away initially very quickly. And there are big differences among them in how quickly that happens. But we need to realize that if we have to make all our blackshank fungicide applications during the first 6 weeks in the growing season, once we get to about 6 weeks after that, once we get to topping time and first harvest, for a lot of them, there's not a whole lot of that chemical left. in many cases. And so doesn't it make sense that that point in time, a month or more after that last chemical application, that there's not much there, and if you've got that black shank pathogen in your soil, that you're going to start seeing problems with plants going down. Also, you remember that Ridamil is pretty water soluble, and with all the rain we've had, and in the last few years, it's not just that it rains, but we used to think a 2-inch rain was a big rain, and now we had at my house we had 7 to 10 inches last week. When you get that kind of volume of water, that's not going to help these materials last long at all. So in this black shank fungicide test, and this has been true for a number of years, we're not just comparing products or chemicals, we're comparing programs. When I started working with tobacco in 1980, a single application of the old Ridamil as a broadcast pre-plant incorporated treatment was a standard for getting black shank control. And then at some point that wasn't good enough and we needed to come back. And for a long time now we've had to look at multiple applications of a black shank fungicide, particularly on older varieties or varieties that have low to moderate resistance to black shank. We need that black shank control program. And that's really what we're testing this year and have been for some time. So you can see the treatment at the top. And for these data tables, you'll note that I've actually sorted them so the treatments that I think might be the best are going to be at the top, and the treatments that might not be so good are going to be towards the bottom. But you see here on this table, RG stands for Ridamil Gold. So we put Ridamil Gold in the transplant water, came back at first cultivation with experimental compound 1, and then came back and applied Ridamil again at lay-by. But on the second treatment, we put that experimental out as a transplant water treatment, and then came back with Ridamil the next 2 applications. And so we've got there's differences in application timing as well as the specific products that were in the test. You can see here this particular row or treatment here is Rondis and Ridamil Gold in transplant water as a tank mix, followed by Presidio at lay-by. You see also that, and this is generally true in my slides, that I've highlighted the data in red that I think might help you see the trends in the data at this point in time most clearly. And so you can see that we still have almost 100% stand in this one treatment, and even then where we've lost about a quarter of the stand in the untreated control, and some of these other treatments, for whatever reason, we're seeing significantly lower stands even in the middle of August, where we've got a significant amount of time left theoretically for a full growing season. And the last black shank experiment I want to talk with you about today involves biocontrol. The Institute for Advanced Learning and Research in Danville, Virginia, apparently they've been doing greenhouse and laboratory research looking at types of bacteria that they have isolated from soil around plant roots. We call those rhizobacteria. And they had, that last spring, they told us that they had 2 isolates of these rhizobacteria that might be helpful for black shank control. So this year we're doing a field experiment in our black shank nursery, looking at those 2 isolates and looking at different application strategies for each of those isolates. And then we're comparing those isolates to either doing nothing, the untreated control, or our standard, which would be to apply Rondis Gold and Ridamil Gold as a transplant water treatment, and then come back with Presidio at lay-by. So we're doing all of this not just on one variety, but we're doing this on 3 different varieties that have different levels of black shank resistance. So as I've already told you, PVH 2275, that's a tough test if you do these treatments with that variety, because it is very, very susceptible. Then with K326, which is kind of one of our most standard flue-cured tobacco varieties with little or no resistance. And then with NC196, which is we all know is a very popular variety right now, and it has moderate levels of black shank resistance. So hopefully we're going to learn a lot from this experiment. At this point, we have not seen any interactions between the varieties and our fungicide biocontrol treatments. And what that means when I say that is that the biocontrol and fungicide treatments are working pretty much the same on all three varieties. We're not seeing that they do one thing on one variety, something different on another variety. PVH 2275, you can see we got less than 2/3 of a stand as of last week. K326 is was holding for now at least, not too bad compared to 196, but we'll see what happens from there on. But here's, in this slide, in this table, you can see what's going on in terms of our treatments. So the row across the top is our standard control, and that's Rondus and Ridamil Gold as a tank mix and a transplant water, followed by Presidio at lay-by. And you see that over the last 3 weeks, we started to lose some plants, but still we've got a 90% stand. Then IALR 267 is one of the isolates from the Institute, and we put that material out in the transplant water, but sometimes we put it out in the first cultivation, and then in both of these situations we put the material out a second or third time at that last cultivation. And then IALR 1835 is the second isolate that the Institute provided to us, and you can see we had a the exact same application schedules for that second isolate, and then you can see the untreated controls mixed in here. You see that through about a month ago, we had very little disease in any treatments, but then at the end of July, all of a sudden, black shank started heating up, but there still wasn't a lot of difference among the treatments. But then last week, we can start to see that maybe some treatment differences are shaking out. And it looks like, just very quick look at the results from last week, like this 267 is not quite, the stand's not quite as high as with the traditional fungicide, but it's hanging in there, at least compared to this 2 application schedule with the 1835. And so you can see there's some interesting differences look like starting to show up in this experiment. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some on-farm tests again this year. Maybe not as many as we've had in the past for a lot of reasons. But I don't have any data to share with you today about those experiments, but I do want you to know they're going on, and we will have those results later in the fall. The Wright family and Taylor Clark are working with us to evaluate 16 of the varieties that are released and available to tobacco growers to check their black shank resistance and see how well they're holding up and how they perform. And we're collecting data on those varieties without using any fungicide, and then also when we're putting out Rondus Gold and Ridamil Gold in the transplant water and coming back with Presidio at lay-by. So we're going to have an opportunity to see how consistent the variety effects are across the fungicides, whether you not use a fungicide, and whether or not that using a fungicide on a particular variety, you get good results no matter what variety you choose. We're also working with Taylor and with the Harrison family looking at wilt management, and I have bacterial wilt management listed here, but actually there's probably also some fusarium wilt mixed in there. We're trying to watch out for that. And the thinking behind this particular experiment is that since we lost Telone C17 as a sole fumigant 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, that maybe our disease control and nematode control hasn't been quite as good. And we don't know, we don't have experimental data for that. and we certainly don't know what we might be able to do about that. So in the experiment that's going on down there now, again, we have these 16 different varieties, so we can collect information on how resistant each of those varieties is to bacterial or ground wilt and fusarium mold if it shows up. But all of these varieties are in fumigated soil, but in blocks we're also applying Vellum Prime, which is a non-fumigant nematicide that's applied in the transplant water. So we're actually in some of these blocks putting that material out in addition to the fumigant, and in some of the blocks we're actually putting the Vellum Prime out twice. Now it's not totally clear whether that's a labeled treatment or not, but we're all doing this purely for research purposes at this point. But the idea is it possible that the reason we may be seeing more wilt of whatever type is because we're not getting good nematode control? Because we do know that managing wilt diseases in tobacco and a lot of other crops is closely tied to getting good nematode control. So here on the research station, we're also looking at tobacco cyst nematode management. We don't lose what we used to this nematode, but that's because we have good varieties and good crop protection agents. But we certainly need to know how resistant the varieties are, because if we don't, the TCN survives for very long periods of time in soil, and if we keep putting susceptible varieties in a field that's infested and have it on a short rotation or no rotation at all, within a few years we're going to start to see, or we may start to see, some real stunting and damage. So we're evaluating those regional farm tests and regional small plot entries for resistance to the cyst nematode, and of course we're also doing a nematicide and biocontrol trial. We've been doing these trials now since 1986, and we've been able to see some good treatments and some bad treatments. But I mentioned with the wilt test that we're going to be looking at combinations of a soil fumigant and a non-fumigant nematicide. And for up until very, very recently, we didn't have any options for nematode control once you started planting. But that's not necessarily true anymore. We have vellum that can be applied as a transplant water treatment, and certainly there's some interest about is it possible that if you combine a fumigant with a non-fumigant nematicide, that you get enough additional pounds and enough higher quality tobacco to more than pay for the extra cost of the vellum or the fumigant. And that's the basic idea that we're trying to test in this experiment this year. And not only do we have some fumigant and non-fumigant nematicides that are kind of traditional to evaluate, but we also have some biological or organic options. And you may have heard me talk about mustard seed meals before as biofumigants, and one such product is called BioSense. And we've also been testing some non-fumigant bionematicides like Magistine and MBI 306. So this year what we wanted to do was to look at these products or treatments individually and in combination, and see if there's any opportunity to actually get better control and better productivity by using these products together, even though right up front realize these are not cheap treatments. And certainly in current situation in here with tobacco now, we don't want to waste money. So one of the things you see here now, the best data that we get from these nematode tests is at the end of the year, from nematode counts in soil and from yield, that sort of thing. But we do collect data in the middle of the year that can give us a hint of what may be coming, and that's what I have presented for you in this slide. And again, I tried to sort things just very quickly based on with the treatments that might be better at the top, where you see them more quickly, and then the the standards of the poorer treatments towards the bottom to compare these two. So this data was taken, I think, maybe about a month ago or so, and you can see we have plant height, the number of leaves on those plants, and the fresh weight of those leaves. And you can see that the treatments toward the top, most of them involve using telone, and we're not too surprised at that. There's nothing new there. I don't know that I see any clear benefit or trends, certainly from adding vellum onto using the telone. And you can notice here we use two different rates of telone. The standard rate for 30 plus years for the TCN and telone is 9 gallons, but the 5 gallon rate looked pretty good as of 3-4 weeks ago. You can see here the BioSense and MBI 306, and we use two different rates of the BioSense, either 750 pounds or 1,200 pounds. Those are expensive treatments because probably costs about $1 a pound, 50 cents to $1 a pound. But we're just trying to do proof of concept with these things at this point. But they don't look really great at this point. And then we've got some Nimitz treatments, looking at banding it. It's not a cheap treatment either. So one of the things we're looking at, can we get good results from Nimitz in a 16-inch band and put out with a, an incorporate a bed conditioner? Can we get good results with that? And certainly here again, you can see some of the rest of the treatments in this trial. And I've just put the telone and the untreated treatments in this second slide so you'd have a reference to them. So the final experiment I have to share with you today is focusing on trying to improve control of target spot. I think we all know that for the last 10 years, target spot has been an increasing problem for us. When we first got Quadris, we were able to get very good control of target spot, but that's not so certain anymore. And one of the potential reasons for that is that we may have used that particular fungicide so often and so frequently that the pathogen has become resistant to it. And we don't really, the only other fungicide that we have registered in Virginia that we can use is Pencazeb, which is a Mancozeb product. And not all tobacco companies will allow any kind of residues of Pencazeb on their tobacco. And it's just not as good a product as Quadris used to be. So we've been really in the hunt to try and find additional fungicides and alternatives or partners with Quadris for some time. This year's test, I think, is going to be a good test in terms of learning something, because early in the season, well before lay-by, the target spot in that particular field was worse than I have ever seen on the research station. It burned leaves off of plants well before we had the chance in some cases to put the first fungicide out according to the schedule. So you will notice here, this is some of our results taken about a month ago. And you will see, and you may recognize this, S2399. I think this is the 4th year that we have in a row that we've tested that particular experimental compound with or without Quash, which is a released fungicide for other crops. And you can see that we saw significantly less damage on these treatments than we did compared to Quadris and the untreated control. And that is very, very consistent with what we've seen in the past. Remember, we put these materials out 3 times, at lay-by, then 2 weeks later, and then around topping time. We've got a number of experimental materials in the test this year, which is a good thing because we need to get as many of them as we can. None of these look quite as good as the S2399 and Quash, but they certainly look perhaps comparable to Quadris, or this Quadris Pencazeb Quadris treatment, which is basically a fungicide resistance treatment. Put out the same Quadris as in our standard, but you put that Pencazeb in the middle there to try and knock out any fungicide-resistant strains that might be creeping up. This Actigard treatment is one that we might be interested in. When I started doing a lot of this work 10 or so years ago, I tested Actigard a fair amount and had pretty good results, but it wasn't quite as good as Quadris, and there were some issues with Actigard, so I dropped it. But in the situation we're in now with Quadris, is it possible that Actigard could be something we could use? And I think that is possible. But look, one of the problems with Actigard is you need to spray it a lot. You need to start spraying before you even have a hint that you have a problem, and you need to keep on spraying. And I'm thinking maybe through second harvest, in order to be, because you're stimulating that plant to be resistant. The length of benefit from spraying it is not very long compared to a standard fungicide. You can see that these lower leaves, those leaves are now gone. They were harvested in that first pulling, and actually these middle leaves here are pretty much gone for most of those plots now too. And you see the similar trends across these two stock positions in this data. This is second slide from that same test, just because there's more treatments I can put on a single slide, and repeated the standards, the Quadris and the untreated, and this Quadris Pencozeb treatment here. And you see a number of experimentals that don't look very good, but we also need to remember that with the exception of this particular treatment here with compound number 3, these things were applied only in the transplant water. So that was, a long time ago when this data was taken. Some of these materials might have some promise, but they would need to be applied more often. And to be honest, when we think about Quadris and the S2399 and Actigard and stuff and the Quash, we put three applications of a lot of those treatments out. So it may be that we just need to take a different application strategy to get better results. And here, just after, a lot of times, we haven't seen target spot in the upper stock positions, but the last year or two, we have seen some disease. So this is some data that was taken about 10 days ago. And again, the first harvest was gone, and we see these trends where again, the same treatments that looked good earlier continued to look good, with the exception of Actigard. And that, I don't know why that might be. It may be because we missed a spray. I'm not sure. I haven't had a chance to get back and double check. But that would be real disappointing if that's something that happens consistently and we can't deal with. And again, just looking at some of these other alternatives and the level of disease we're seeing. Again, these disease levels are much lower than on the bottom leaves, and so whether or not they're enough to be economically worth considering, but they certainly give us some indication about the activity of these particular compounds and treatments. And finally, it's time to wrap up, but I want to give a lot of thanks to a lot of people. Certainly Spence Irby and Molly Webb and Tori Love and Tyler Russell, people collected all the data that you've seen here. Certainly David Reed and his tobacco agronomy team that helped me so much. And certainly, again, the SPAREC Southern Piedmont Center field crew and staff. Without them working hard right along all this year, none of this information would be available. Certainly for Taylor Clark and the growers that have worked with us this year and for many years, just so many thanks I owe them. And certainly the tobacco and agribusiness industry, especially those of you folks in Virginia. I really thank you a lot for all the help, because without working together, none of this would be possible.